August 14, 1944. The roads outside Chartres, France were choked with dust and the smell of burnt metal. Sergeant James Dalton wiped the sweat from his forehead as his jeep rumbled past the skeletal remains of what had once been the Abbey of Saint-Pierre. The walls were cratered, the roof collapsed inward like a broken rib cage. Somewhere in the distance, artillery still thundered, a reminder that the war was far from over. Jim had seen plenty of ruins in the past 2 months since D-Day. Caen had been a nightmare of rubble and corpses. Falaise had been worse, but something about this place felt different. Maybe it was the silence, or maybe it was the cross, still standing amid the rubble, tilted but unbroken, casting a long shadow across the scorched earth. Private Tommy Reed sat beside him, gripping his rifle with white knuckles, eyes darting nervously at every shadow. The kid was 21 but looked younger, especially now with his helmet too big for his head and his hands shaking slightly. Tommy had joined the unit 3 weeks ago, fresh off the boat from Brooklyn, full of ideas about glory and heroism. France had beaten most of that out of him. They had been ordered to secure the area around the Abbey, where intelligence reported a makeshift German prisoner camp had been abandoned in haste. Command wanted confirmation. They wanted numbers. They wanted to know if there were any stragglers, any holdouts who might cause trouble as the Allied advance pushed deeper into France. What they found was worse than abandoned. It was chaos. Dozens of wounded men lay scattered across the courtyard, some in tattered Wehrmacht uniforms, others in civilian clothes stained with blood and dirt. Flies buzzed over bloodied bandages. The stench of infection and death hung heavy in the air, mixing with the acrid smell of smoke still rising from a burnt-out truck near the gate. And in the center of it all, kneeling beside a dying soldier, was a woman in a black habit, Sister Marguerite. Jim noticed her immediately. She was bent over a young German soldier, no older than Tommy, pressing a cloth to a gaping wound in his side. Her hands were stained red, her face pale but focused. She whispered something in French, then in broken German, and the soldier's breathing slowed. His eyes, wide with fear just moments before, began to close. She made the sign of the cross over his chest, her lips moving in silent prayer. The soldier exhaled one last time, and then he was still. She stayed there for a moment, her hand resting on his forehead, before closing his eyes gently. Then she stood, took a deep breath, and moved to the next man. Jim approached cautiously, his hand resting on his sidearm. Tommy followed, his rifle raised slightly, though his hands were trembling. The woman didn't look up. She simply moved to the next man, a French civilian with a shattered leg, bone visible through torn flesh, and began wrapping a fresh bandage around the wound. Her movements were practiced, efficient, almost mechanical. She had done this hundreds of times before. "Madam," Jim called out in his rough, American-accented French. She paused, finally glancing up. Her eyes were gray, tired but sharp. She didn't look afraid. She looked annoyed, as if Jim were interrupting something far more important than his presence warranted. "You are American," she said in English, her accent thick but clear. "You took long enough." Jim blinked. Tommy lowered his rifle, slightly confused. "We're here to secure the area," Jim said, switching to English. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" "I am Sister Marguerite. I am doing what I have always done, saving lives." She turned back to the civilian, tying off the bandage with a firm knot. The man groaned, his face contorted in pain, and she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, murmuring something soothing in French. The man's breathing steadied slightly, and his eyes, wild with panic, began to focus on her face. Jim looked around. There were at least 40 men here, maybe more. Most were German soldiers, prisoners of war. A few were French civilians caught in the crossfire when the Germans had retreated. All of them were wounded, some critically. Blood pooled on the cobblestones. Makeshift bandages, torn from sheets and clothing, were everywhere. And this woman, this nun, had been caring for them, alone. "Where are the Germans?" Jim asked. "The soldiers who were guarding this place?" "Gone," she replied without looking up. "They left 2 days ago when your tanks came close. They took the healthy ones and left the wounded. They said the dying were not worth the trouble." She said it matter-of-factly, as if cruelty were just another fact of war, something to be noted and moved past. Jim felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had seen plenty of cruelty in this war. He had seen SS officers execute civilians, He had seen American soldiers shoot surrendering Germans out of rage. He had seen French collaborators beaten in the streets. But something about this, about leaving wounded men to die alone, felt particularly cold. And you stayed. Someone had to, she said simply. She finished with the civilian and stood, wiping her hands on her already filthy habit. She was shorter than Jim had expected, barely 5 feet tall, but she carried herself with a presence that made her seem much larger. Her face was lined, weathered by years of hard work and harder choices. Now, she said, looking Jim straight in the eye, if you are here to help, then help. If you are here to arrest me, then arrest me. But do it quickly. These men do not have much time. Jim hesitated. Protocol was clear. Anyone found among enemy combatants was to be detained for questioning. Collaboration was a serious charge, especially in occupied France. The Free French forces were ruthless with collaborators, and the Americans had learned to be cautious. But looking at this woman, at the blood on her hands and the exhaustion in her eyes, he couldn't bring himself to see her as a threat. Tommy, Jim said quietly, get on the radio. Tell command we need medics. Now. And water. Lots of water. Tommy nodded and hurried back to the jeep, grateful for something concrete to do. Jim turned back to Sister Marguerite. You're coming with us, he said. For questioning. She nodded, unsurprised. As you wish. But first I must finish. She gestured to the men lying around them, some moaning, some silent, some staring at the sky with glassy eyes. Jim opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He holstered his sidearm and knelt beside her. What do you need? For the next 2 hours, Jim and Tommy worked alongside Sister Marguerite. They carried water from a well near the abbey, held down screaming men while she cleaned wounds with alcohol that made them shriek, and did their best to follow her rapid-fire instructions in a mix of French, English, and occasionally German. Jim had seen plenty of field medics. He had worked alongside them in Normandy, watched them operate under fire, seen them save men who should have died. But none of them were like her. She worked with a calm intensity, never flinching, never hesitating. When a German soldier grabbed her wrist and begged for morphine in a voice raw with pain, she gently pried his fingers loose and told him in German that she had none left, but that God was with him. The soldier wept, his face crumpling like a child's. She stayed with him, holding his hand until he stopped. Jim watched her move from man to man, and he began to notice things, the way the wounded men looked at her, not with fear or suspicion, but with something close to reverence. A young German, his chest wrapped in bandages, reached out to touch the hem of her habit as she passed. An older French civilian, his face gray with blood loss, whispered, "Mercy, mercy, mercy," as she adjusted his pillow. Even the men who were unconscious seemed to breathe easier when she was near. Tommy noticed it too. "Sarge," he whispered at one point, kneeling beside Jim as they lifted a wounded man onto a stretcher. "She's like, I don't know, like an angel or something." Jim didn't respond, but he didn't disagree either. By the time the American medics arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Sister Marguerite stood, her knees stiff, her habit caked in dirt and blood. She looked at Jim and nodded. "I am ready now." Jim gestured to the jeep. Tommy climbed into the driver's seat, and Jim helped Sister Marguerite into the back. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, silent, as they drove away from the abbey. The road back to the division headquarters was rough, and the jeep jostled over potholes and debris. Jim glanced back at her several times, but she stared straight ahead, her expression unreadable. The countryside rolled past, fields scarred by tank tracks and bomb craters, farmhouses reduced to rubble. "What made you stay?" Jim asked finally, breaking the silence. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was soft, almost lost under the rumble of the engine. "Because they are human. Because God does not abandon the suffering, and neither should we." Jim turned that over in his mind. He thought about the men he had killed, the German machine gunner he had shot in the face at St. Lo, the sniper he had bayoneted in a barn outside Carentan. He had never thought of them as human. Not really. They were the enemy. They were obstacles. They were targets. But this woman saw them differently. Even now, covered in their blood, she saw them as something worth saving. "Did you know any of them?" Jim asked. "The Germans. Did you know them before?" "Some," she said. "A few were stationed in Chartres during the occupation." They came to the Abbey sometimes. For Mass. For confession. She paused. They were young, homesick, afraid. Just like your soldiers. Jim felt something twist in his gut. He didn't want to think about that. He didn't want to think about the enemy as young or homesick or afraid. It made everything harder. They arrived at headquarters just after dark. The camp was a sprawling collection of tents and vehicles, lit by harsh floodlights that turned everything into stark shadows. Soldiers moved about, cleaning weapons, eating rations, smoking cigarettes, laughing at jokes Jim couldn't hear. The normalcy of it felt jarring after the Abbey. Jim escorted Sister Marguerite to the interrogation tent, where Captain Robert Henderson was waiting. Henderson was a tall, lean man with sharp features and sharper eyes. He had a reputation for being thorough, which was a polite way of saying he trusted no one. He had been an attorney in Boston before the war, and he approached interrogations like cross-examinations. He looked Sister Marguerite up and down, taking in her filthy habit and blood-stained hands, his expression giving nothing away. "Sergeant Dalton," he said, without taking his eyes off her. "Explain." Jim gave a brief report, describing the scene at the Abbey, the wounded men, Sister Marguerite's work. Henderson listened, his expression unchanging. When Jim finished, Henderson nodded curtly. "Leave us." Jim hesitated. "Sir, I don't think she's a threat." "I'll decide that, Sergeant." Dismissed. Jim left reluctantly, casting one last glance at Sister Marguerite. She met his eyes and gave him a small, reassuring nod, as if she were comforting him instead of the other way around. Outside, Tommy was leaning against the Jeep, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands. "You think she'll be okay?" he asked, his voice tight. Jim didn't answer. He didn't know. Inside the tent, Henderson sat across from Sister Marguerite at a folding table, a notebook open in front of him, a pencil in his hand. A single bulb hung overhead, casting harsh light and deep shadows. He asked her name, her age, where she was from. She answered each question calmly, her hands still folded in her lap. "Marguerite Leclerc, 38 years old, born in Rouen. I joined the Sisters of Mercy when I was 19. I have been at the Abbey of St. Pierre for 12 years. Why did you stay at the Abbey?" Henderson asked, his pencil poised. "To care for the wounded. The German wounded. Yes, and the French wounded, and anyone else who needed help." Henderson leaned forward slightly. "Do you understand that caring for enemy soldiers can be considered collaboration?" "I understand that caring for the suffering is my duty. Captain Henderson, I am a nurse. I am a servant of God. I do not ask which flag a man serves before I stop his bleeding." Henderson's jaw tightened. "Did you provide information to the Germans? Did you assist them in any way beyond medical care?" "No." "Did they ask you to?" "Yes." "And what did you tell them?" "I told them that I serve God, not nations." Henderson studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face for any sign of deception. "Did you have a choice? To stay or to leave?" "I always have a choice, Captain." "I chose to stay." "Why?" "Because no one else would." She said it simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Henderson closed his notebook slowly. "You'll remain here tonight. We'll continue this in the morning." He called for a guard, and Sister Marguerite was escorted to a small tent at the edge of the camp. It was sparse, just a cot and a thin blanket, but she didn't complain. She lay down, closed her eyes, and within minutes, she was asleep, her breathing deep and even. The next morning, Jim was up early, checking on the prisoner compound as part of his duties. It was a fenced area where captured German soldiers were held before being transported to larger POW camps further behind the lines. There were about 60 men inside, most of them sitting or lying on the ground, exhausted and defeated. Many were wounded, bandages visible under their torn uniforms. Breakfast was being distributed by 2 American soldiers with a cart, handing out bowls of watery oatmeal and stale bread. But something was wrong. Jim noticed it immediately. None of the prisoners were eating. They sat with their bowls of rations in front of them untouched. Some stared at the ground. Others whispered to each other in German, their voices low and urgent. The guards were confused, shouting orders in broken German, but the prisoners didn't move. Jim approached one of the guards, a corporal from Ohio named Peters. "What's going on?" "I don't know, Sergeant. They just won't eat. We gave them the food, but they won't touch it." Jim frowned. He walked closer to the fence, studying the prisoners. One of them, a young man with a bandage wrapped around his head and dried blood crusted on his temple, looked up. His eyes were hollow, but there was something in them. Recognition. "You," the prisoner said in accented English, his voice hoarse. "You were at the Abbey. Yesterday." Jim nodded slowly. "Yeah, I was. Where is she?" "The sister. Where is she?" Jim hesitated. "She's here. Being questioned." The prisoner turned to the others and said something in rapid German. A murmur spread through the group like a wave. Then, one by one, the prisoners stood, their movements slow but deliberate. An older man, his arm in a sling and his face lined with exhaustion, stepped forward. He looked like he had been a soldier for a long time, maybe since the First War. "We will not eat," he said in halting English, his voice firm despite his condition, "until she prays for us." Jim stared at him, not sure he had heard correctly. "What?" "She saved us," the older man continued. "She stayed when everyone else left, when our own officers abandoned us, when we thought we would die alone. She stayed. She is a saint. We will not eat until she prays." The other prisoners nodded, their faces solemn. Some made the sign of the cross. Jim felt a chill run down his spine despite the warm morning air. He turned and walked quickly back to headquarters, his mind racing. He found Henderson in his tent, reviewing reports and sipping coffee from a tin cup. "Sir, we have a situation." Henderson looked up, irritated at the interruption. "What now?" "The prisoners. They're refusing to eat. They want Sister Marguerite. They want her to pray for them." Henderson's expression didn't change, but Jim saw his jaw tighten. "That's absurd. They're prisoners of war. They'll eat when they're hungry. With respect, sir, I don't think they will. I think they mean it." Henderson stood, setting down his coffee with a sharp clink. "Show me." They walked to the compound together, Henderson's stride brisk and purposeful. The scene was exactly as Jim had described. 60 men standing in silence, their rations untouched on the ground before them. Some had their hands clasped in front of them. Others stood at attention despite their wounds. It was eerie, this silence, this unity. Henderson stared at them, then at Jim. "This is a stunt." "It's not, sir. I saw what she did at the Abbey. These men, they believe in her. They really believe." Henderson was silent for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he turned and walked back toward the tent where Sister Marguerite was being held. "Bring her," he said over his shoulder, his voice clipped. Jim followed. Inside the tent, Sister Marguerite was sitting on the cot, her hands folded, her eyes closed in prayer. Her lips moved silently, and there was a peacefulness about her that seemed out of place in a military camp. She looked up when they entered, her gray eyes calm and questioning. Captain Henderson stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "The prisoners are refusing to eat," he said flatly. "They want you." She stood slowly, smoothing her habit. "Then I will go to them." Henderson didn't move. Why would they do this? Why would enemy soldiers refuse food for a French nun they barely know? She looked at him, her gray eyes steady and unwavering. "Because they know that mercy has no nationality, Captain, and neither does God. In their darkest hour, when their own country left them to die, someone stayed. Someone cared. That is what they remember." Henderson stared at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. Then he stepped aside. 5 minutes. That's all you get. Jim escorted her to the compound, Tommy trailing behind them. As they approached, the prisoners saw her, and a wave of movement rippled through the group. They pressed against the fence, calling out to her in German, their voices rising in a chorus of desperation and hope. "Sister, Sister Marguerite, Schwester Marguerite, bitte, segnen Sie uns, beten Sie für uns." The guards looked to Jim, uncertain and visibly uncomfortable. Jim nodded, and they opened the gate slowly, the hinges creaking. Sister Marguerite stepped inside, and the gate closed behind her with a metallic clang. The prisoners parted, forming a semicircle around her. She stood in the center, small and frail in her black habit, yet somehow commanding the space. The morning sun caught her face, illuminating the lines of exhaustion and the quiet strength in her eyes. She raised her hands, and the men fell silent instantly. Even the guards stopped moving. The entire camp seemed to hold its breath. She began to pray, not in Latin as Jim expected, but in German. Her voice was soft but clear. carrying across the compound with a resonance that seemed impossible for someone so small. Vater unser im Himmel, geheiligt werde dein Name, dein Reich komme, dein Wille geschehe, wie im Himmel, so auf Erden. Jim didn't understand all the words, but he felt their weight. He saw the prisoners' faces change. Some closed their eyes. Others wept openly, tears streaming down their dirty faces. The young man with the head bandage sank to his knees, his shoulders shaking. The older soldier with the sling bowed his head, his lips moving along with hers. She continued, her voice never wavering. Und vergib uns unsere Schuld, wie auch wir vergeben unseren Schuldigern. Und führe uns nicht in Versuchung, sondern erlöse uns von dem Bösen. When she finished, she made the sign of the cross slowly, deliberately. The prisoners did the same, their movements synchronized, almost ritualistic. Then she spoke again, this voice softer, more personal. You are far from home, she said in German, her accent imperfect but sincere. You are afraid. You are in pain. You wonder if God has forgotten you. She paused, looking around at each face. He has not. You are still his children. You are still worthy of his love. No matter what you have done, no matter where you have been, you are still human. You are still beloved. One of the prisoners, a boy who couldn't have been more than 18, let out a sob. Others followed. It was as if something had broken inside them, something they had been holding back for months or years. The sound of grown men weeping filled the compound, raw and unashamed. Sister Marguerite moved among them, placing her hand on shoulders, touching foreheads, murmuring blessings. She stopped before the young man with the head bandage, the one who had recognized Jim. She placed both hands on his face, looking into his eyes. Was this dein name? She asked gently. Klaus, he whispered. Klaus Zimmermann. Klaus, she repeated. You will survive this. You will go home. You will see your family again. Do not lose hope. Klaus nodded, unable to speak, tears streaming down his face. She moved on, stopping before the older soldier with the sling. Und Sie? She asked. Friedrich Steiner, he said, his voice thick. Hauptmann. She smiled faintly. Not here you are, just Hauptmann. Friedrich. Just a man who needs God's grace. Like all of us. Friedrich's face crumpled, and he bowed his head. Danke, Schwester. Danke. She made her way through the group, and slowly, one by one, the prisoners returned to their places. They picked up their bowls. They began to eat. The compound filled with the quiet sounds of men eating, of life continuing. Jim watched, stunned. Henderson stood beside him, his face pale, his usual composure cracked. Tommy was openly crying, not even trying to hide it. She's not a collaborator, Jim said quietly, his voice rough. She's something else entirely. Henderson didn't respond for a long moment. Then he cleared his throat. No, she's not. Sister Marguerite walked back to the gate. The guards opened it and she stepped through. She looked at Henderson waiting. You're free to go, Henderson said, his voice tight. We have no grounds to hold you. You'll be escorted back to the Abbey. Sister Marguerite nodded. Thank you, Captain. Henderson looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Jim stepped forward. I'll take her. That afternoon, Jim drove Sister Marguerite back to the Abbey in his jeep. Tommy came along, silent for once, lost in his own thoughts. The countryside rolled past, still scarred by war but touched by the golden light of late afternoon. When they arrived, the medics were still there, tending to the wounded. More supplies had arrived. Some of the men had been stabilized and were being prepared for transport. The Abbey, though still in ruins, felt different. It felt alive. Sister Marguerite climbed out of the jeep slowly, her movements stiff. She looked at Jim, and for the first time, he saw something like weariness in her eyes. Thank you, Sergeant Dalton. Jim shook his head. I should be thanking you. You showed me something I'd forgotten. And what is that? That we're all still human, even in this. She smiled faintly, a sad, knowing smile. Do not forget it again. The world needs men who remember. She turned and walked back into the ruins of the Abbey, her black habit disappearing into the shadows. Jim watched her go, his throat tight. Tommy started the engine, but Jim didn't tell him to drive. Not yet. He sat there staring at the broken cross still standing amid the rubble, and for the first time in months, he felt something other than anger or exhaustion or fear. He felt something like grace. The war would go on. Men would keep dying. The killing wouldn't stop just because one nun had shown mercy. But somewhere in the chaos, there were still people like Sister Marguerite. People who chose compassion over hatred. People who reminded him why they were fighting in the first place. Not for territory or glory or revenge, but for the possibility of something better. For the idea that humanity could still be saved. Tommy glanced at him, his eyes red. "Sarge, you okay?" Jim nodded slowly. "Yeah, kid. I think I am." They drove away, the Abbey fading behind them, but the memory of that day stayed with Jim for the rest of his life. The weeks that followed were a blur of combat and movement. The Allied advance pushed deeper into France, then into Belgium, then into Germany itself. Jim fought in the Ardennes during the brutal winter of 44. He crossed the Rhine in the spring of 45. He saw the concentration camps, the evidence of atrocities that made him question everything he thought he knew about humanity. But through it all, he remembered Sister Marguerite. He remembered her calm in the face of suffering, her refusal to see enemies, only people, her belief that mercy mattered even when the world seemed determined to prove otherwise. He wrote letters to his wife back in Pennsylvania, trying to explain what he had seen, what he had felt. He never quite found the words. How do you describe witnessing grace in the middle of hell? When the war ended in May of 1945, Jim was in Bavaria. He celebrated with his unit, drank too much, cried with men he had fought beside for a year. But even in the joy of victory, he felt incomplete. There was something he needed to do. In the summer of 1946, after he had been discharged and returned home, after he had held his wife and met his infant daughter for the first time, after he had tried and failed to readjust to civilian life, Jim made a decision. He borrowed money, bought a ticket on a ship to France, and went back. He returned to Chartres in August, almost exactly 2 years after that day at the Abbey. The city had been rebuilt, the scars of war slowly healing. The cathedral, miraculously spared from destruction, stood tall against the blue sky. Jim made his way to the Abbey of Saint-Pierre. It had been rebuilt as well, the walls repaired, the roof restored. It looked almost new, as if the war had never touched it. He walked through the gate, his heart pounding. A young nun greeted him in the courtyard, her habit crisp and clean. "Bonjour, monsieur. Comment puis-je vous aider?" Jim struggled with his French. "I'm looking for someone." "A nun who was here during the war." "Sister Marguerite?" "Marguerite Leclerc." The young nun's face clouded. "I am sorry, monsieur. There is no one here by that name." Jim felt his stomach drop. She was here, in 1944. She stayed to care for the wounded when the Germans retreated. She saved lives. The young nun shook her head slowly. "I have only been here for a year, monsieur, but I can ask the Mother Superior." She led Jim inside through cool stone corridors that smelled of incense and beeswax. They came to a small office where an older nun sat at a desk reviewing papers. She looked up, her eyes sharp and assessing. "Mother Superior, this man is looking for someone. A Sister Marguerite Leclerc." The Mother Superior's expression changed, something softening in her face. "Ah, Marguerite? You knew her?" "I met her," Jim said, "during the war. She was here. She cared for wounded soldiers. I wanted to thank her, to tell her what she meant to me, what she meant to all of us." The Mother Superior was silent for a long moment. Then she stood and walked to the window, looking out at the courtyard. "Sister Marguerite was a remarkable woman," she said quietly. "She had been with us for many years. She was our best nurse, our most devoted servant." Jim noticed the past tense. "Was?" The Mother Superior turned back to him, her eyes sad. "She died, monsieur, in October of 1944, just 2 months after you met her." Jim felt the room tilt. "How?" "She returned to the Abbey after you released her. She continued to care for the wounded, both Allied and German, but she had been working for days without rest, without food. She collapsed. We tried to save her, but she had given everything she had. Her body simply gave out." Jim sank into a chair, his legs weak. "I didn't know. I never knew. Few did," the Mother Superior said gently. "She was buried in our cemetery, a small grave. She would have wanted nothing more." Jim sat there for a long time, unable to speak. Finally, he looked up. "Can I see it? Her grave?" "Of course." The Mother Superior led him outside. through a garden to a small cemetery behind the abbey. The graves were simple, marked with plain wooden crosses. She stopped before one near the back, shaded by an old oak tree. The cross read simply, Sœur Marguerite Leclerc, 1906-1944, Servante de Dieu. Jim knelt before it, his throat tight, his eyes burning. He had come all this way to thank her, and now he never could. He thought of her face, calm and determined, her voice soft but unwavering, her hands stained with blood, moving from one wounded man to the next. He thought of the 60 prisoners who had refused to eat until she prayed. He wondered if they knew. He wondered if they remembered her, wherever they were now, back in their homes in Germany, trying to rebuild their lives. He hoped they did. He hoped they told their children and grandchildren about the French nun who had stayed when everyone else left, who had seen them as human when the world saw them as monsters, who had reminded them that they were still worthy of grace. Jim stayed there for a long time, kneeling in the grass, the afternoon sun warm on his back. He didn't pray. He had never been a religious man, but he made a promise. He promised to remember. He promised to tell her story. He promised to live in a way that honored what she had taught him, that we are all human, that mercy matters, that grace is possible, even in the darkest places. When he finally stood, his knees aching, he felt something like peace. He touched the wooden cross gently, then walked away. Years later, Jim would tell the story to his daughter, then to his grandchildren. He would tell it to anyone who would listen. Some believed him. Some thought he was exaggerating, that memory had made the story larger than life. But Jim knew the truth. He had been there. He had seen it. And he would never forget. Because in the midst of war, in the darkest hours of humanity, Sister Marguerite had reminded him of something essential. She had reminded him that they were still human, that they were still capable of compassion, that they were still worthy of grace, and that no matter which side of the war they were on, they were all children of the same God. The 60 men who refused to eat until she prayed never forgot either. In the decades after the war, some of them would return to Chartres. They would visit her grave. They would leave flowers. They would tell their own stories of the French nun who had saved them, not just from death, but from despair. Klaus Zimmermann became a pastor in Munich. He spoke often of Sister Marguerite in his sermons, calling her a living example of Christ's love. Friedrich Steiner returned to his family in Hamburg and spent the rest of his life working with refugees, helping the displaced and forgotten. When asked why, he would always say the same thing: because someone once helped me when I had nothing. Someone once saw me as human when the world saw me as the enemy. And so her legacy lived on, not in monuments or medals, but in the lives she had touched, in the mercy she had shown, in the grace she had given freely without asking for anything in return. Jim Dalton died in 1998 at the age of 83. His last words, spoken to his daughter as she held his hand, were about Sister Marguerite. "I hope I made her proud," he whispered. "I hope I remembered." His daughter squeezed his hand. "You did, Dad. You did." And in a small cemetery behind a rebuilt abbey in Chartres, France, under the shade of an old oak tree, a simple wooden cross still stands. The name has faded with time, worn by decades of wind and rain, but the words remain, just barely visible. Servante de Dieu, servant of God. And though few remember her name now, though history has largely forgotten her, her story remains. A reminder that even in the darkest times, even in the midst of war and hatred and death, there are still those who choose mercy, still those who choose love, still those who remind us what it means to be human. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. History is full of forgotten heroes, and together, we can make sure their stories are never lost.